Yes, a very good morning to you. It is Thursday, the 22nd of October 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and as always, I've been out looking through the black book of journalists, trying to make sure I can get somebody to come on the show who can provide the insight, the analysis, and the assessment of some of the biggest stories making waves in the world of Australian sport. And so pleased to be able to ask Mel Woods from Australian Associated Press to join me on the show again. How are you down in Melbourne?
I'm great, Pete. Thank you very much for having me back. I enjoyed it last time, and yeah, happy to be back at this pointy end of the season for so many sports.
Yeah, there certainly is plenty happening from an AFL and NRL perspective, and we will look at those sports ahead of their grand finals today, but we'll also take advantage of your all-round knowledge and talk some football and also some rugby union as well. But look, let's start down in Melbourne in the NRL, and fantastic article from friend of the show, Brad Walter, on NRL.com. And he tells us that Penrith aren't the only team in Sunday's NRL Grand Final who are built on the back of developing their own talent. The Melbourne Storm will match the Panthers in having 13 players who have made their NRL debut at the club that they still call home. Of the Melbourne Storm 17, only Josh Addo-Carr, Brenko Lee, Jerome Hughes and Dale Finucane debuted elsewhere. And to be fair, of that list, really only Finucane was an established first grader elsewhere before coming to the Storm. The chief difference between the two teams, Mel, is that while the Panthers produced their talent on site, and we know how good that Panthers academy and their local pathways are, 11 of the 17 Melbourne Storm players spent time in the Queensland Cup through the Storm system before graduating to their NRL team. How much credit should we be giving the Melbourne Storm for the development of their own squad? I mean, I know that these aren't Victorian born and bred players, but it shows pretty remarkable recruiting now and also development capabilities.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's impractical, really, to expect the Melbourne Storm to recruit solely from Victoria. I mean, they simply just don't have the player depth here in the local competition. So, yeah, it is about recruitment for them. And for Craig Bellamy, I mean, he certainly, lives by the ethos of one man's trash is another man's treasure, because he and his right-hand man, Frank Panisi, really just have a knack of identifying just talent from all over the place, whether it's in New Zealand or clubs, and they just see something in a player and really just make them to be the best that they can be. Brenko Lee is a great example in his fourth NRL club, and here he is on the cusp of playing, Origin. He's really settled into the Storm. So yeah, it's pretty amazing, really, what they've been able to achieve.
I think from a player's perspective, knowing that playing for the Melbourne Storm or being part of that pathway or that system will give you the best opportunity to fulfil your potential must be a massive carrot. I mean, some of these players were involved in development pathways at other clubs. We know that Cameron Munster was at the Broncos. We know that Ryan Pappenhuisen, of course, was at the West Tigers. Look at guys like Suliasi Vunivalu and Christian Welch who came to even Nelson Afosa Solomona, who've come to the Storm really via rugby union pathways as kids. But that lure of playing for Bellamy and being part of such a successful franchise, you can't underestimate that, I wouldn't have thought, Mel.
Yeah, absolutely. He certainly is a major carrot, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens at the Storm when there is no Bellamy, because I think people just see it as an opportunity to, play under the best and learn from the best. But, if there's no Smith and there's no Bellamy there, it will be interesting to see if that changes going forward. But, everyone talks about the system that they have in place. So you'd like to think that they'll be able to carry it on even sort of past this golden era.
Yeah, I mean, they've been able to replace, obviously, greats of the game like Billy Slater, Cooper Cronk, even Ryan Hoffman and the impact he had on that football club. And as well as that, some of the great assistant coaches who've rolled through that club and gone on to head coaching roles elsewhere. Adam O'Brien at Newcastle Knights being a great example, but also Michael Maguire, Anthony Seibold and others as well. Huge challenge will obviously come when Bellamy and Smith do move on to pastures new, whether that is at the end of this season for Smith and next season for Bellamy or slightly different to that. But the next man up mentality that they seem to have in place has been extremely impressive. And you look at someone like Jerome Hughes playing in such a key playmaking position now. He's a New Zealand international. He played one match for the Titans in 2013 and then one match for the Cowboys 3 years later, and was signed in 2017 as a backup fullback. And look at him now playing in the halves and playing Test football and a real pivotal part of that grand final team. So congratulations to the Melbourne Storm. Kudos to them and look forward to seeing how they go on Sunday. Our second story this morning takes us to the AFL, and it's the story from Reece Homfray in the Advertiser. He's been speaking with the likes of Port Adelaide star Tom Rockliff and also Adelaide Crows player Brodie Smith, and also Port Adelaide president David Koch about the 2021 AFL season. Homfray writes that players are bracing for another hefty pay cut next year amid fears it could be even bigger than the 30% that was slashed from their wages this year. The AFL Players Association believes the proposal that it put to the league last week is fair and reasonable. They've declined to comment any further on the demands or the negotiations, but I think everyone hopes that the 2021 salary cap, the pay cuts, and also the list sizes will all be resolved before free agency opens on October 30. Players gave up a combined $100 million this year with a 50% pay cut over the past 7 months, which equated to a 30% reduction across the whole year as a result of the pandemic. And we also know, of course, how much they sacrificed to keep the season going in regards to living in hubs and operating in bubbles. Once grand final week's done and dusted, Mel, we're going to need to think about what 2021 looks like. The AFL really led the way alongside the NRL this year in finding resolutions with broadcasters and players to get the seasons up and running. Is it reasonable to assume that players will have to continue to make some pretty big sacrifices through the form of a significant pay cut in 2021? And how important is it for the AFL to finalise list sizes so players who are out of contract can have a little bit of certainty?
Yeah, it must be really tough for players that are sort of right on the fringe there. I've read, about some of them have been told to, continue training, but yet they don't have any guarantee of what their future really looks like. So I think number one, really, that needs to be nailed down. It's a tough environment and the clubs have lost so many of their football staff. But yeah, certainly the players need some certainty as to what their future looks like. And also, I guess, you'd like to know if the VFL competition and those sort of competitions, the feeder competitions, are going to be up and running. But then again, we're almost at November, and here we are in Melbourne, and we've only just been allowed outside our 5 kilometre zone. So it's really hard to know what the whole situation around the world is going to look like. In terms of salary sacrifice, I believe that they will certainly have to take some kind of hit next year. 30% seems a little stiff, particularly obviously if we can get full crowds back, but it's a bit of the unknown, isn't it? I suppose someone needs to make the call there, but yeah, 30% doesn't really sit too well with me. I think perhaps 20 at the most, I suppose, but I'm not really, I'm more of a word kind of person than numbers, so I'm glad it's not my call.
Yeah, I think, it's pretty indicative of societal challenges that across lots of different industries, people are taking, whether it be pay cuts or scaled working hours, and that continues, around the country and the world in lots of different industries. So footballers are no different in that respect, but, there is obviously the flip side of that being that this is a limited time span of a career for them. It's peak earning potential for a lot of these guys who will never earn, in the latter stages of their professional careers, working careers, in a different profession. They'll never earn anything like what they're earning now. So it is going to have a significant impact on their futures. I think the sacrifices they made cannot be underestimated. And there's, a lot of considerations to take into place here, such as, whether the players on a rookie contract, for example, should be taking the same percentage of salary cut as the players on a full contract, whether players who have heavily front or back end loaded contracts need to see some kind of equalisation there across the length of their deal so they're not unduly affected as well. But for me, it's exactly what you said. The players who are on the cusp, who don't know if they're going to be playing next year, they need that certainty. We need the AFL to come out really no later than Monday or Tuesday of next week and announce what the list sizes and the salary cap will be like. They've already announced what they're doing with the football department spending. So give players the opportunity to find new homes. We know that a player who might be player number 40, for example, on Richmond's list, could be as high as 25 or 30 on another club, perhaps not in the premiership window. So we need to make sure they get the opportunity to move sooner rather than later. Our third story today, we stay in the AFL, and I thought this was an exceptional piece by Courtney Walsh and John Stenshalt in The Australian, looking at Geelong and describing them in a term I've never really considered them as. Geelong being a moneyball team, beating the AFL's socialist equalisation policies. I think the subs had a lot of fun with that headline. Story details that Geelong president Colin Carter was actually the man who, in a bastion of capitalism, designed the AFL's socialist democrat equalisation system, under which player drafts and salary caps were meant to stop teams dominating for years. The irony, of course, being that Geelong has won the most matches in the AFL in the past 10 years, the past 20 years, and the past 30 years, effectively beating the system that Carter helped construct. Based on the US sports communist models where most revenue is shared between big clubs and small, when he was a powerful force at AFL headquarters back 30, 40 years ago. The article looks at the fact that Geelong is a city of only 250,000 people, yet its beloved football club keeps beating the teams from the big cities, not only on the field, but also off the field in the demand for star players when they come onto the open market, and that's illustrated no better than the fact that Geelong has been nominated by GWS spearhead Jeremy Cameron as his favoured new home. Players prefer living in the quiet surfing villages 15 minutes out of town along the Great Ocean Road, or in the case of full forward Tom Hawkins, on a farm where he's able to run ahead of 32 Angus cattle. And the moneyball theory around the salaries and how they're split amongst the team and players, playing for significantly less than perhaps they would if they played for one of the big teams in Melbourne has been, the real heartbeat of that football club. One final stat here. Carter says that Geelong has not had a draft pick inside the top 10 since Joel Selwood was taken 7th in 2006. He also describes the club as middle class in wealth terms, and it drafts judiciously and trades for good players from elsewhere. Mel, how attractive is it for athletes to be able to live and play in Geelong, and how much credit should we give that football club for the consistent excellence that they've produced over the past few decades, even though it has only resulted in the 3 premierships?
Well, obviously, a lot of credit. I mean, it's just it's a really interesting story that the journalists there have worked through. At the end of the day, I mean, it's sort of success breeds success, doesn't it? That you get great players there, other players want to go and play with them. And Geelong's an hour out of town. It's a lovely spot around that area. So, why wouldn't you want to go and live there if there's the opportunity, to play with, fantastic players with the chance of winning a flag pretty much every year. And also you live in an area where obviously real estate is not nearly as expensive as it is in Melbourne. So you're getting a lot more bang for your buck there. So, kudos to Brian Cook and his men there for what they've, established, and Chris Scott, obviously, as coach there to sort of continue the success that, the Geelong Cats have had for the last, 10 years or so.
Yeah, I know when I was living back in Melbourne, I often used to dream about the concept of living in a Torquay or Anglesey and jumping on the train into the city every day, and increasing numbers do exactly that. Also important to acknowledge that the Cats haven't just brought in big fish like Patrick Dangerfield, like Jeremy Cameron will be, like the return of Gary Ablett. There's guys on that list like a Gary Rowan who, really his time was probably up at Sydney. He'd had a lot of injury problems, some really tragic circumstances off the field for he and his family as well along the journey, and wasn't playing great football at the Swans and perhaps didn't have much of a future there. But he's been revitalised by the shift to Geelong. He was absolutely superb last weekend in the preliminary final, and the culture of that football club, as much as the physical location, has played a critical role in their success. I mean, I know that you won't have spent a lot of time within that environment, Mel, but in the times that you have been around Geelong, whether it be down at the club or post-game in that environment from a football perspective, has that culture been quite apparent and quite clear to you?
Well, interestingly, I think, if we even link back to the first story that we talked about and the Melbourne Storm, I think there's probably some similarities there. It's about getting good people in the club. It's about the culture. It's about, the next man up mentality. Obviously there's a real care and love amongst the players for the club, like there is in Geelong there. So there is certainly a good vibe around the club. And I sense that about Melbourne as well, in terms of the Storm. So I can see some similarities there between both the clubs.
Fantastic. Well, we'll move to rugby union now, and ahead of the third Bledisloe Test in Sydney in 9 days' time, the Wallabies have unveiled their new Indigenous jersey. In years gone by, of course, we know Curtly Beale was a driving force behind that jersey, which has been introduced and updated since 2017. But Beale now plays in France, and there aren't any Indigenous players in the Wallabies 44-player squad at this current point in time. Mark Ella, who is an absolute legend of rugby in Australia and a proud Indigenous man, spoke about maybe Andy Muirhead from the Brumbies being somebody who he would like to see in the mix. And we know Rugby Australia has invested a lot of money in there. Indigenous pathways and the different initiatives that they've rolled out over the last couple of years, and the Dream Big Time program, for example. Rob Clark and Hamish McLennan have both conceded more could be done to bring more Indigenous players through playing rugby union. Clark's saying there's a lot of work we've done to try and harness the extreme talent that exists out there for sport amongst the Indigenous community. Rugby needs to do a better job, and we'll do that with additional programs in coming years. Rugby Australia, I think, Mel, should be applauded for their continued commitment to the wonderful Indigenous jersey they play in and their increased investment in recent years in Indigenous pathways. How important is it for rugby in Australia to see Indigenous players coming through the pipelines and competing to play Test rugby? Because there have only been 14 Indigenous Wallabies thus far.
It's not very many, is it? I actually was surprised that it was so few. And obviously, with Curtly Beale's departure to France, we don't have any Indigenous players. I think, because if you look across rugby league, there's so many great players and AFL for that matter. So it would be certainly something that you'd like to see more growth in. But as you said, the Indigenous jersey is a cracker. I bought my son one for the World Cup last year, and he loves it. You just like to obviously see more players out there. They've got programs in place. And Andy, it'd be great to see Andy Muirhead take that next step. He must have been close this year. It's great to see that they've got these pathways in place, and hopefully the next player to take that step isn't too far away.
And of course, we have seen the likes of Maurice Longbottom, Johnny Porch, Dylan Peach all playing in the Australian men's rugby sevens team as well. The likes of Mahalia Murphy and Talina Simon coming through in the women's side of things and playing in sevens, and also for the Wallaroos and now in the NRLW as well. So these programs will take time to bear fruit. We can't expect success overnight, but what we really need to see is Indigenous youth growing up who are passionate about sport, be really interested in rugby union alongside rugby league and AFL with that traditional strong presence. Our final story this morning, it's a story from Tracy Holmes via The Ticket and ABC, looking at the fact that FIFA is beginning its process of selecting Australian and New Zealand host cities for the 2023 World Cup. They're conducting virtual workshops with the 12 candidate cities. The Australian cities hoping to be selected are Adelaide, Brisbane, Launceston, Melbourne, Newcastle, Perth and Sydney, covering 6 states there. In New Zealand, Auckland, Christchurch, Dunedin, Hamilton and Wellington are the 5 cities in the mix. The last Women's World Cup held in France in 2019 was staged across 9 cities, so it must be worth noting that the number of competing nations has expanded from 24 to 32. So interesting to see how many of those cities get the opportunity to play a role in what I've previously described as, I think, one of the most important sporting tournaments in Australian sports history. In general, the legacy of this tournament needs to be around participation, it needs to be around exposure, it needs to be around equalisation from a sporting perspective. Love to take your thoughts, Mel, particularly as a trailblazer in your field, as a female sports journalist as well, and how important the 2023 Women's World Cup will be in establishing a legacy for women's sport in Australia and the broader region.
I think, as the saying goes, you can't be what you can't see. So to have the Women's World Cup on this stage, international stage, but also obviously hosted in Australia and New Zealand, is just going to be a massive thing for the code. I think that they're looking at something like 60 million women's players FIFA would want to see playing by 2026, which really isn't very far away. So it already is a massive code. I think it's a real opportunity for the game to make a real stamp on the Australian landscape. I know that there's, you'd like to see more facilities for women, more use of grounds. Obviously, it's difficult now having to share all the facilities and grounds. There's a real opportunity for the Matildas and women's soccer to make a real impact on the landscape here.
Yeah, I think if I compare it to the last major football tournament hosted here in the Asian Cup, that was so reliant and cognizant on the Socceroos performing well and, to really retain a lot of interest and dominate media airwaves. I feel like, and I'm really hopeful that this will be a little bit different, that yes, the Matildas, will go into the World Cup as one of the main hopes and we'll certainly be rooting for them to go all the way. But at the same time, I feel like the opportunity has been presented to really capture the hearts and minds of Australia, men and women, boys and girls, regardless as to how the Matildas perform. And that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to have the games travel to places like Launceston and the likes that have been put up as possible host cities. It's about sort of spreading the love, spreading the message, seeing these athletes. And also I think, with the Matildas and the players that you can see regularly playing in the Premier League now and across the world, and that there's a real evident sort of pathway there for junior female soccer players. And I think that this will really sort of underline that there's an opportunity for them to really make a career and a success of themselves.
Yeah, extremely well said, and absolutely no surprise that that's a fact. Melissa Woods, thank you so much for joining me on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff today. Fantastic to catch up with you bright and early in the morning. I really appreciate your insights and your knowledge, being able to dissect these big stories.
Thanks so much for having me, Pete. I really enjoyed it. So, all the best to you too.
Thanks so much for watching and listening to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. As I've mentioned earlier this week, we will wrap up for 2020 at the end of this week. So we've got one episode to go, and with the AFL and NRL Grand Finals to preview, I'm really excited to be joined by Natalie Ioannidis tomorrow to go through all of the big stories there. Catch this wherever you usually get your podcasts and, of course, online via Twitter, YouTube and the like. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.